Hello. Well, welcome to the webinar, Understanding Different Chinese Consumers. Before we start, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of South Australia is on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, and acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. And I'd like to extend that respect to Aboriginal peoples from other areas of South Australia and Australia who may be present with us today. So welcome to all UniSA alumni, colleagues and friends who are tuning in from around the world. I'm Imogen Bilby and I work in the advancement team here at UniSA, and we know many of us who are online are not able to see our close friends and family at the moment, and hope that you're well and safe wherever you are. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. This webinar is live and we will be recording, which means filming only the presenters and not participants. The chat function is not enabled today, but you can post questions in the Q&A down at the bottom, and time permitting we'll endeavour to get to as many of these as we can. The only thing left for me to do is to introduce UniSA's distinguished alumnus Stephen Drummond, who is live from Shanghai. You can wave at us at the moment. Stephen is Chief Strategy Officer at Holmes and Marchant, as well as campaign coach and creative strategist based in China, with over 30 years experience in brand strategy, including leading roles both in agencies and client side. Stephen has global brand expertise in Asia Pacific markets, leading campaigns for Unilever, J&J, Audi, HSBC, Mars, Danone, Gap, Volvo, Dell, Nike, Beam Suntory, Bacardi, InBev and Coca-Cola for Asia Pacific and China. I'm glad I had a sip of water before I did that list. He is strategic leader and marketing guru with a flair for the creative, the former chairman and chief strategy officer at Y&R China, and the former APAC Creative Excellence and China IMC director at the Coca-Cola Company. Stephen, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. And can you hear me? Is that okay? Look, welcome everyone from Shanghai. Thank you very much for the welcome. Today I'm going to go straight into this presentation, which has got admittedly a bit of a heavy title. It's using psychographics to understand trends and opportunities in the Chinese consumer market. Now, of course, being a UniSA alumni in marketing, it is totally appropriate that I start with a quote from Ehrenberg Bass and the distinguished Professor Marchant, and that quote is, "Targeting is a bit like salt in cooking. A little helps, but too much ruins things." So the way to think about this presentation is that this is about discovering the right sort of targeting seasoning for modern China. So this presentation will be about prompting thinking about the type of targeting seasoning that's right for today. It's about avoiding irrational limitations, especially dated demographic models, which still are dominant in China. It adds some contemporary psychographic flavoring. We'll talk about the psychographic segments in China. And it's particularly important for new brands and developing new categories. So we'll see how, if we're talking about foreign brands or new categories like wines, cheeses, and even coffees, that these are new categories for China. So it really is helpful to understand the marketplace and where you should be putting your money and putting your creative message. So from the outset, I think it's very important to come out with this. And there's a bit of a debate in the marketing community about demographic biases and overuse of demographics. And it really is an issue, and has become an issue in China for quite some time. It is time to purge these demographic biases in Chinese marketing. It's very interesting because I've been here for 25 years, so I've been on the full ride throughout this. In China, there's actually been a historical emphasis on young adults. Now, this debate has raged in the Western world as well, but in China even more so. So it's young adults in first-tier cities has really been the only target. It's almost like a mental default that marketers use here. These people are considered the only people that embrace openness and responded favorably to new brands and new categories. as I said, it's very much around the same around the world. Everyone's using millennial definitions, but it's particularly amplified in China as an issue, which really has a limiting bias. And it's interesting to look where this has come from. When I first arrived 25 years ago, there were major generational chasms in China, linked in very much in difference between the older generation, I'm talking about those over 40, 25 years ago, who had grown up in the austere pre-1980s time, versus that new generation, so we're talking about, say, 1995, who matured during the 1990s. And it's a key truth. It's not just a China thing, that challenging periods, long challenging periods of economic deprivation and struggle can fundamentally shape consumers. So what you were seeing in the mid-90s was, if you were, say, 40 plus in the mid-90s, you tended to be quite conservative in your choices, and you stuck with familiar local brands. The arrival of foreign brands was really picked up on by a younger age group. But this has fundamentally changed. So 20 years ago, there was an underlying truth to this bias towards the targeting, towards the younger generation, and why marketers should have targeted to them. There's also this assumption that back then, which partly held true 25 years ago, that tier one was much more sophisticated, and lower tiers were relatively backward and simply wouldn't adopt new products or new brands. All of that has changed, and importantly, I think we need to start to think a little bit like demographics as kind of astrology for marketers. There's this inbuilt assumption that for some magical reason, everyone born within a certain time frame behaves in a certain way. So you hear these terrible cliches about Chinese millennials believe that ... or post-80s Chinese think, or 40 plus Chinese prefer and are more conservative. Very wild generalizations that simply don't hold as true anymore. And our thinking here also helps avoid other generalizations like, Chinese like status brands, or Chinese prefer foreign brands. It depends on the category, but importantly, it depends on the psychographics of the people. And it's really the new China realities, if we look at the difference over the last 25 years and how this has changed, and why demographic limits really need to go. There's much less of a generational bias, first of all. The old generational gap, and as I said, there was a very significant gap driven by socioeconomics back in the mid-90s, but that's begun to flatten out. You've now, old generational gaps no longer exist in such a dramatic way. You've still got life stages, of course, but you've had over 30 years of consistent positive growth, and that has started to shape similar generations and similar values. You've also got lower income barriers. Going back 20, 25 years, you had far more disparate socioeconomic levels. You still have different layers, of course, in Chinese society, but you've now seen the middle market really, and the lower end of the market come up to the middle. So income as a demographic factor is increasingly less of an issue. Now, that obviously depends on the category. You have to factor that in. But for regular packaged goods, it's become less of an issue. Another thing too is that you're seeing in New China fewer regional differences, and I particularly talk about the old definition of the city tiers, the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. In the mid-90s, of course, everyone would come in talking about only targeting tier 1 cities, which is a huge limiting factor, of course. Now, sometimes that was determined by the fact that the realities of distribution systems, but the reality is that has changed now. You're seeing mobile and connected China. You're seeing physical infrastructure, whether it's highways or trains. You're seeing much more mobile Chinese population physically, and you've got a connected e-commerce world, and you've got the delivery systems to get to them. So, and of course, the media systems are now available. So the north, south, east, west divisions and the tier 1 down to tier 3 divisions are less pronounced than they used to be. They still exist, but they are less of an issue for many categories. So all in all, it means that there should be less demographic factors, and we should start to look at more psychographics in our targeting. So just a note about what we mean about psychographic targeting. So this psych model is based on needs and motivations, which provide a platform for understanding the market. Importantly, how it's changed in China. It can replace or augment traditional demographic targeting in a manner that reflects new China. It's whether it be focused creative messaging based more around motivations or more efficient media channel planning. And the model is based on something called the brand asset valuator, which has been in place since the 1980s and used across the world, and is a combination of Maslow thinking and Jung thinking. Some important notes and caveats before I get into this. Psychographics are imperfect model tools. But it is, as we'll see, more realistic reflection of the population, and therefore most people, more useful. But most people, of course, don't really fit into neat little boxes, whether they be demographic or psychographic. Now, while based on quant data, this is a limited snapshot and urban only. I'm a planner, I'm not a researcher, but so I always take the data with a pinch of salt, particularly studies in China, where even the most robust studies, because of the population size and scale, have limitations. I'd urge you to look at this as the general contextual story that this study tells, and how insights into Chinese consumer society is developing, and how that can help determine the targeting approach that is right for you. It is based on 8 cities with a study of 4,000 per wave in total from 1992 to present. As I said, it's something based on data from something called the brand asset valuator. Now this is based on 50 administered questions on a 7-point scale. Very interesting point how this is changing. However, the psychographic models, the newer models are based on scraping social media data, which is a very controversial method in the West. You may have heard of Cambridge Analytica. If you're wondering about where psychographic modeling is still existing today, it's actually been hugely controversial, of course. Cambridge Analytica applies psychographic techniques behind the Brexit vote and the last presidential election in the US. And obviously that actually worked in its time, but it's now been caught up as a very controversial thing. And of course, in China, you're talking about data scraping from Weixin and Weibo and other social media forms as the basis for how they group people. But this study, as I said, there are 7 values-based segments that we're looking at that really follow the principles of core Maslow mixed with Jung. The 7 are the reformers, the explorers, the succeeders, the aspirers, the mainstreamers, the strugglers, and the resigned poor. And let's take a few minutes to look at each of these groups, who they are, and importantly, how they've changed over the last 15 years. Because as I said, a key thing is the trend shift in these consumer segments that gives you the picture of where society's headed. The first group, and one of the most important groups, are the explorers. And all of these have Chinese expressions and Chinese names too. But this group are, and unfortunately, I need to change these pictures because it's a little bit reflective of more of a younger group. But the reality is that explorers are people who are characterized by their attitudes and values. And that's the whole point of psychographics as opposed to demographics. This is the group who are characterized by being very energetic, very outward looking people. So this is the group who are most experimental and most interested in new ideas from outside China, but increasingly some ideas inside China as well, new ideas in general, or the new frontiers, and that is, you are seeing this characterized by, very quickly, this is the group of people who are backpacking by themselves or with a friend in Jordan, as opposed to the old cliched tourist group holding the little flag as a group. These people are much more into unconventional experiences. They're a major growing segment that's vital for new brands. They are, if you like, the textbook early adopters who are just vital when you're talking about entering or coming into China with a new category. And what we found was very important, and as we'll see, that, like I said, it's not just an age group, and this is really the crux of it. This group has actually increased in size. So going back over 15 years, it was small but important group of around 7%. And what we found is that this group has now doubled in size to being 14% of the 18 to 65-year-olds. It's a very significant size group. And as we'll see, they're not just significant in terms of size, they're significant in terms of their influence. They are the early adopters, but also the early influencers. The next group are the aspirers, and the aspirers are characterized by being the more look at me generation. Now, this is a real TikTok selfie, a bit self-obsessed, if you like. This is the group who is much more concerned with being attractive on the outside. It's about short-term appearances and how other people see them. They need reassurance that brands are cool before they risk losing face. This group shares some similarities with the explorers, but in a way is pretty obviously less sophisticated and more just, let's have fun, let's look at me. The reformers are characterized by being more of an introverted, intelligent, educated group, somewhat passive intellectual. There's a mix of desire for intrinsic quality and personal fulfillment, but they're less concerned about superficial imagery. There's quite a few in the academic class that fit in the reformer category. The succeeders are a really important group, and I think back in the mid-90s, they were perhaps the dominant affluent group. And they're still seen as almost a benchmark for how a lot of people still see Chinese consumers in terms of a cliche. These are people who are openly displaying their success. If anything, it's a combination of old China values adopting Western big status values. So it's driven by old China status and face. As I said, they were traditionally dominant in China, but are now in relative decline as there's been a values shift towards being more modern and experimental and experiential. It's about the move away from the old status brands as wealth badges mentality. Part of that is I think China has been through that whole feeling of, well, a lot of Chinese people have been through the whole feeling of must show out with big brand status, and now there's a lot of people, particularly explorers, who are growing in size, who find that a bit distasteful and prefer brands that are more down key. This group is very important. You can imagine if you are, this was the traditional target audience for, say, prestige cars, prestige cognacs, and so forth. These marks in prestige cars and in, say, cognac and even whiskey are now having to revise the fact, because these brands, if they are still stuck in succeeder territory, they are becoming somewhat dated. As you see, the trend is that they have been in major decline, going from 18 to 11% over the last 15 years. And that's significant. So you are seeing people like Mercedes-Benz shift their emphasis away from the succeeder mindset, the big status expression, to a more thoughtful, explorer-based targeting approach. And the most significant group in terms of size, pretty much in every society around the world, are the mainstreamers. This group, very importantly and very interestingly, has doubled in size. A little bit like in the same way the explorers have doubled in size, so have the mainstreamers, but they're very, very different people. But what's interesting is where they have come from and how they've grown. The mainstreamers are people who are driven by security. They are conformists who seek a simple, conventional family lifestyle. The significance is they have grown in numbers over the last decade, as the strugglers, who it will be the next group we'll share, have actually declined in size. So we don't have a perfect statistical line to that, but the correlation is quite clear. This is due to a mark of China's middle-class economic growth. So if you had to, well, this is values-based, but there is clearly more alignment with mainstreamers as being, say, the lower end of the middle class, if you like. This group has a very strong sense of family and home, habitual, risk-averse followers in the marketplace. They are, of course, a very big prize for mass market brands because of their scale. The reality is that they prefer big, well-known, value-for-money family brands, and particularly local brands. So this is real local brand heartland. The strugglers have declined a lot, and as I mentioned, that's actually good news for Chinese society, because to go from a very large 23% in the early 2000s now down to 10% is very important. The strugglers don't lead a particularly happy existence. They are people who are frustrated by their situation today, seeking a brighter future. There's a lot of pressure on them to provide for the family. As I said, they have declined in numbers as Chinese society has changed and improved. So it's good news for China. This group, you may see it, and once again, it's not an age factor. The young end of the scale, and there used to be very large groups of young strugglers in northeastern China, for example, as there was some industrial decline back in that period, and you were seeing net cafes full of young strugglers just in the virtual world. Then you had the family strugglers often living day to day. This group would seek brands that promise change and instant fulfillment. Now, I think it's very important to point out that this has been a snapshot of 8 first and second tier cities, even though the tier definition is not quite right anymore. It has been a snapshot. You would be seeing a lot more and some more significant numbers of strugglers in so-called lower tier China. That is the reality, because this group is very much defined by socioeconomics, as is the next group. And this is a group who are defined as the struggling poor, who it's a mix of elderly or rural immigrants or so forth who don't have that much hope in changing their present. Now, the reality is there's always going to be a certain percentage of the population who is as disenfranchised as this group. It hasn't changed over the last 15 years. So that's a very brief introduction to the 7 key groups. And as I said, importantly, you've seen the change of in those 7 groups. Now, something very significant is, and I appreciate it's a little bit hard to follow this chart, and there's too many numbers on it, but the important thing is the profiling of the psychographic groups by age cohort. And this is about proving my point in that the spread of psychographics goes across age groups. So you're starting to see groups like the explorers, for example, in the purple, the second bubble, being spread very evenly across different age groups. So it's not just a age-specific group, as the cliche in China marketing would tell you. And the same really applies for all of these. So you're seeing society develop where, and this is a key insight, that Chinese society has developed to the point where there's been enough consistency and enough increases in income that people are naturally falling into more aligned personality typings rather than their values being dictated by socioeconomics. We'll come back to this because this is an important point. And this really helps, particularly for marketers who are looking to enter the China market. It does, in my 25 years experience here, you do see how the classic adoption curve can be assisted by understanding where the psychographic groups are. The explorers and the aspirers being the classic early adopters, the succeeders and mainstreamers, very much being followers in that adoption process. Seen that across many categories. Now, in terms of the big picture stories that this is telling, as I said, between those years, you're seeing growing modern, what I've called look at me segments. The explorers will be talking about look at me where I've traveled. The aspirers may be talking about look at me because of what handbag I'm holding. But it's still a outward progressive mindset. So there's big growth in that, and that's very positive thing for marketers. Back on this point about age groups and the explorers, because around the world, and this model is used around the world, explorers have a tendency towards being quite young, and it's aligned with being at least under 30. A very interesting thing that's happening in China is that actually it's 18% of 50 to 60-year-olds fit into this explorer mindset. So these are people who are passionate about trying new experiences, brands, products. And importantly, these days, they probably have the income levels to support that. So it's very important to note that 50, targeting for most marketers, the briefs that you get will cut off at 50. And yet there's a massive group of these people. And in terms of the age profile of China, they also represent a very significant group in terms of sheer numbers too. It completely challenges this whole point about the older generation being conservative and therefore not worth targeting. So that the age limitation is dramatically wrong from most marketers, and people need to think about how they apply psychographics. That the explorers have as I mentioned, they've really redefined what status looks like. Look at Me is increasingly gone from being superficial brand associations to status by unique experience, and of course there's still that look at me characteristic, but as I said, it's look at me and where I am, some exotic location, rather than look at me and my big brand handbag. I pointed out before, you've also got fewer strugglers and more mainstreamers, which is extremely healthy for Chinese society overall. You are likely to see, and once again, dispelling a cliche, the younger group in China is also feeling the heat and increasingly becoming security seekers. They are not just explorers, because these are the people who are struggling with getting, particularly on the real estate ladder in China. Living costs are on the rise. There's lots of pressure to own your own apartment, own your own car, tick all these obligation boxes, and the child's education, which is becoming very expensive. So 25 to 34-year-olds are feeling that, and that actually there's a level of there's a significant percentage of that group who are becoming more conservative because of it, even in cities like Shanghai. That's again, that goes against the cliche. Mentioned before that this important watching out for high status brands, because you do have the succeeders in decline. These old masculine control symbols of status, which were once the standard measure of success in China, have really come back in terms of the number. They're important as a group, but they're increasingly being replaced by this more progressive and outward-looking explorer group. Now, I mentioned this before, that China is no longer split by such north, south, east, west values. Traditional cliches and differences have been flattened out by the shared experiences of the modern and mobile China, and are largely irrelevant in most categories. Now, I caveat here, because you will see presentations about China talking about how China, it's not just one country. It's like, and I don't mean that in a political sense. I mean, it's not just one country in terms of values. It's much more like Europe and so forth. Now, not being a Chinese person, and it's always very interesting to get a local perspective, of course, which is the study is based on. But the reality is there are more things in common with mainland China than are different. There will be differences in weather, which can influence some product preferences. There are differences in cuisines, of course, and that can dictate preferences. But overall, you're seeing quite similar development of values based on a very much a shared experience that people across China have had, whether it be through their school life or all the economic changes. You're seeing much more of a alignment across China than anything else. So recognize the differences comes down to product categories or specific local tastes, but overall values, you're still seeing a flattening out and much more of a alignment across China. And you can see that in the numbers. You are seeing, sorry, this is a bit difficult to read, but at the top you've got, say, Shenyang. So Shenyang may be more challenged economically than Shanghai or Beijing, characterized by the bigger numbers of, say, mainstreamers. But you're starting to see some similarity. These are the 8 cities that we looked at. You're starting to see very similar profiles, even though they have quite different levels of socioeconomic activity. Now, the important thing about psychographics is psychographics can help new brands and categories determine the right sort of targeting seasoning. and as Emergent said, I used to work for Coca-Cola, but unlike Coca-Cola, you can't start out in China, or you can't market in China by targeting everyone with a mouth. New brands and sometimes new categories need to be realistic due to high media costs in China, but at the same time, we need to recognize we need to avoid limiting reach or narrow our creative messaging. If we're thinking about how you can apply this model and where this can help, these are 4 categories and 4 brands that I've actually worked on and had experiences with. If you think of cheese, if you think of foreign wine, if you think of pasta and big pasta brands, and you think of coffee and Starbucks, the very interesting story behind all of these categories is that they were all mainstream brands in their home markets or in the West, but they've tended to succeed or are on the road to success in China really as early adopter brands. So I'll just give you some cases here. Bell Cheese is the largest cheese company in the world, and this was a fairly recent challenge. So their long-term brand ambition was to create an entirely new cheese stacking occasion. Now, this is a well-established occasion in the West. Social occasions, basically cheese by itself with wine. The challenge in China is that while people know cheese and they have cheese is pretty much widely available, and cheese on pizza, there's simply not really the habit of eating solo. I'm going to put it to people, you need to remember that these big categories that may be so well established in other markets are very new to China. It's a very new thing to eat cheese by itself. Outside of sophisticated areas, say in Beijing and Shanghai, it's not a common thing. In fact, the way I put it to people, it's the equivalent of trying to sell tofu to a Western market. There's a certain limited, maybe inner city group that will be the early adopters of, say, tofu in Sydney versus selling cheese in Shanghai. Probably a similarity. But importantly, in discussions, we were talking with Bell about who they should be talking to for creative media at this early category development stage. And the starting point, and this was pretty much agreed on straight away, was a discussion, well, this immediate assumption that we should be talking to married people 25 to 40 years with children and put an income filter on that, 20,000 RMB household plus. And it didn't take long before, and thankfully we had good media partners at the time, we were talking, and look, there was no point in putting these demographic limitations. And the first one was, had 3 demographic limiting factors. Married. Well, the fact is single households, non-traditional households are increasingly common in China, in urban China. 25 to 40 years of age, realistically made absolutely no sense. The reality is a lot of younger people in urban China are still living at home because of, as I mentioned, the cost of living. So at the younger end, there was no point to that. It was absolutely ridiculous to put a cap on this as 40. Anyone over 40 would not be interested in eating cheese, when we just saw that those people who were more experimental, there were significant groups in the 20-year cohort above from 40 to 60. And with children, I remember we were talking about with children at home, and actually the challenge here was to establish an adult occasion. So you had 3 completely irrelevant factors. You also looked at the income level. Was that really worth imposing, or was that just becoming another limiter? So a much better alternative was to strip away these limiting demographic factors and look at early adopters. And it is possible, not specifically through this model, but through CMMS, which is China Media Marketing Services model, which is available through media buyers, for example. You can get key psychographic questions that align with these sorts of psychographic groups and get them to apply that. And then you can look at also some complementary category usage, say imported wine, without these limiting demographic factors. So that's a case in usage. Then if we're looking, and please just take this as a hypothetical example, but yeah, how important it is. If you are talking about the difference in the media placement, if you're talking about a wine brand, if you said, okay, well, let's go with the assumption we're talking to 25 to 35-year-olds with an income filter, which is quite common. Your media plan would look like that red circle. You would be talking to that group, and you would be talking to a significant number of people who probably have absolutely no interest and a very low likelihood of adopting a new foreign brand of wine, versus the green circle, which is much more around a psychographic cluster. And as you can imagine, the media placement behind that is dramatically different. So in terms of wastage, in terms of reaching the right number of people, difference between psychographics and demographics can be quite dramatic. So 45 minutes. The 5 key takeaways before a bit of Q&A. First point is generational demographics only model is outdated and limiting. Psychographics, really please don't take this as here's a new big piece of research. So you use this as a thinking approach. Think about the psychographics behind your category or your brand. And are there better ways than limiting demographics to do your targeting? Life stage and income can be factored in. And I use the examples of if you're selling baby milk powder or if you're selling Ferraris, yes, of course, your demographics will matter. Use common sense. You can actually overlay that without adding too much salt to the targeting. Remember that, and I'm sure if we're talking about a broader group here that is looking to market to China, mainstream brands or categories in one market can be explorers in China. Now, you recall I mentioned pasta. We had conversations a few years back with the world's largest pasta maker, who was adamant and excited about the fact that their brand stood for mainstream family values in their home market. And we actually had to break the news to them that actually pasta is essentially exotic noodles in China. And actually the kind of people eating pasta here are not your mainstream old happy family groups in the middle market. They're actually the younger people trying something newer and different. So what's mainstream outside can be very much leading edge in China. The same applies even for tins of soup. And number 5, just think outside of the first tier box. It's dated. It used to be driven by socioeconomics and distribution. Now, socioeconomics have increasingly flattened out for mass market brands and goods. And in terms of delivery systems, of course, with China, you've got this incredible infrastructure and incredible e-commerce system now, which has also taken away from the need just to focus on the first tier, the old definition of the first tier clusters.
Thank you again, and thank you to everyone that's been watching.
Okay.
We will
Thank
be
you,
sending
everyone.
a link with the video and a short survey, which we would really appreciate you filling in. And thanks again from South Australia and from Shanghai. And we'll see you soon.